Now we look at Reconstruction, how the Union's put together. Look at the proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, Restoration, Radical Reconstruction, the Military Reconstruction Acts, Alaska Purchase, impeachment, carpetbagger, the scalawags, no difference between the two. Credit Mobilier scandal, the National Greenback Party, what came to be called the Compromise of 1877. The end of war and disaster, life goes on. The question is, when you face an incredible situation, you face defeat, what are you to do? Life goes on, but how will you live? How do you face tomorrow? That is the question the South now faced. The nation faced the question, how will the Union be rebuilt? How will the South be reconstructed? How do they prevent what happened, caused the Civil War, from happening again? What is the challenge this is the challenge they face. Rebuilding the Union and bringing all these Confederates that fought so bitterly against the Union back into the country. Now, the policy of reconstructing the South was a great challenge for lawmakers before the war even ended. After the war, the South lay in ruins. Now, all the wealth of the South had been locked up in slaves and Confederate bonds. After the war, the Confederate bonds are worthless. Confederate money was worthless. Inflation was out of sight by the end of the war. But no one's trading Confederate bonds, slaves, which they're counting as money. They're free. Can't count as money. So the South had nothing. Put it this way. The richest state in the Union in 1860 is Mississippi. The poorest state in the Union in 1870 was Mississippi. It hasn't been the poorest state in the Union ever since. Because Mississippi had put everything it had into slaves and Confederate bonds, which were now nothing. So you can see how poverty had slavery had masked the real poverty in the South. Absent slaves, the South has nothing. 4 million slaves are free. The question is, what to do for them? Advocates of a minimal policy favor a quick restoration of the Union with little protection for black civil rights beyond emancipation. But radical proponents, the radical Republicans, demanded punishment. The South had to be punished. The South had to be broken. They wanted to place loyal Unionists in charge of new state governments, give African Americans basic rights of citizenship. But Lincoln and Johnson, though, favored more conciliatory policy. Eventually, the tensions between Congress and the presidency became so great that it forced a constitutional showdown. Now, the first phase between 1863 and 1867, something called presidential reconstruction. Which Reconstruction was handled by the presidents as a military matter, and Congress largely let presidents have their way. For the most part, there was some criticism. Now, Lincoln's plan, the proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, it's the middle of the war. They're trying to bring the Union back together as quickly as possible. Bring those Confederates kind of on the fence, or those who see that the Confederacy is losing and looking for a way out, give them a chance to come back over to the Union. Now, this plan allows Union government to be restored. If 10% of the qualified voters from 1860 renounce secession, it is repudiate the idea of secession with every label and pledge loyalty to the Union. And once they did this, they could hold a series of constitutional conventions and be readmitted. Set up their government free from secession, restore the government. Because this system had Union governments operating in Arkansas and Tennessee by 1864. Under these new constitutions, these new Unionist constitutions, slavery is outlawed in both states. But Congress, dominated by Republicans and Northerners, they were unwilling to allow these former Confederate states to come in and sit down just like nothing had happened, at least from their perspective. Instead, they demanded more stringent demands on the Confederates. Congress passed the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864. The repudiation of Lincoln's policy in an attempt to try to put in more stringent standards on readmission. This plan, 50% of all men qualified to vote in 1860 had to pledge loyalty to the Union. They had to renounce secession. And they had to end slavery and guarantee legal and political equality for African Americans. That's to treatment. Basically, get rid of all the conditions that basically caused the Civil War in the first place. The majority have to pledge loyalty to the Union, they have to renounce secession, and they have to end slavery, and make African Americans equal to whites politically and legally. That is, guarantee full civil rights and freedom. Well, Lincoln's fearing this may alienate a lot of Southerners and may delay the attempt to try to bring the Union back together. He doesn't veto it, but instead issues what can be called a pocket veto. That is, Congress was out of session and he didn't sign it, so basically he didn't directly renounce it, but it just simply didn't become law. Well, after Lincoln's death, Johnson tries a policy similar to this, but just a little bit more stringent: restoration. Now, Johnson had been a strong Unionist. He grew up very poor. He was illiterate until he got married. In fact, his wife taught him how to read and write. He was a tailor, a small-town mayor before rising up in the ranks of Tennessee politics. But he hated the planters, the upper classes who had ruled Tennessee. So they always looked down on him, and now it was his time to turn the tables on him. So Johnson is very critical of the planters, the planter classes. He wants to make certain guarantees about restoring the South to the Union as well, which initially pleases some Northerners, but as the tale starts playing out, it ends up causing some problems. New Unionist government had been established in 1864 under Lincoln's plan. Slaves had been freed there as well. They may have heard the term Juneteenth before. Sometimes celebrated in southern Arkansas, portions of northwestern Louisiana, and Texas. This is not the day that slavery ended. Remember, it happens in several phases, several dates all over the country. The April 16th, I believe, is Emancipation Day in Washington, D.C., marking where slavery has ended there. Several states ordered, like New York and Pennsylvania, ordered slavery ended on July the 4th. The Emancipation Proclamation signed on January the 1st. But June 19th, this is what happens here. June 19th, 1865, this is when Union troops landed at Galveston Island in Texas and were now able to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. They're able to enforce the end of slavery. So this is when the slaves in Texas learned they had been freed and it can now be enforced. But still, actual reports, slavery still existed in some remote areas of East Texas until the autumn of 1865. slavery would not be finally formally ended until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December. Well, Restoration, at Johnson, he's asking for more stringent demands on the restoration of the South to the Union. With Restoration, Johnson is looking for federal officials may have property and voting rights restored, those were seized and taken from them, if they apply for a presidential pardon. They have to get a pardon directly from the president, that is, Andrew Johnson. States have to be readmitted only if they repudiate the Confederate debt. To that in a minute. Repudiate this debt. Repudiate secession. And ratify the 13th Amendment, one that would end slavery. They had to do that if they want to be readmitted. But the thing is, Johnson wasn't consistent. He allowed some Confederate officials and others through without a pardon. Some states readmitted without ratifying the 13th Amendment. For example, Mississippi. They actually didn't formally ratify until 1995. Doesn't mean slavery was legal in Mississippi until 1995. Ben there may argue otherwise. But what it meant was they didn't add their approval to it. The 13th Amendment was basically ratified without their approval, which was not necessary because they had 3/4 majority states. But now Lincoln, towards the end of his life, was showing willingness to compromise, especially on the black suffrage issue, that is, making these new states guarantee the right to vote to the freedmen. But he's killed before his final intentions became known. But Johnson, basically what ends up happening here is by late 1865, the South has put back in place new Unionist governments, but it has the old Confederate officials in charge of it. Alexander Hamilton Stevens, who had been the Confederate vice president, is sent as a congressman from Georgia to Washington, D.C. You have Confederate generals who are coming into Congress as members of Congress. And for these Northerners who watched sons and nephews and brothers die and badly fought battle themselves, this was too much. They had to show some kind of penance. They had to change their ways. The group that basically had started the Civil War had to be wiped away. The South had to be wiped clean, broken, and rebuilt. So as a result, all these congressmen and senators from these newly reconstructed states were not allowed to take their seats in Congress, told to go home, start over. But Johnson and the radical Republicans, those most in favor of these stringent changes in Southern governments, they're clashing repeatedly as it turns in 1866. Say Johnson is arguing, vetoing legislation, basically becoming a real nuisance for radicals in Congress. But what some important changes, though, did take place? 13th Amendment is ratified on December 18th, 1865. It ends slavery permanently. Slavery will never come back. The Constitutional Amendment is in place. It is gone. The question is what to do about the freedmen. We have one proposal, 40 acres and a mule. Now, this was just a proposal in 1865. Congressman George Julian of Indiana and Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts basically had the idea of basically taking the plantations, the ones the slaves had built, taking these plantations, breaking them down, and distributing the property to the slaves, basically as a form of compensation, helping them get started again. Basically giving each freed slave 40 acres to work on, which would have been more enough to take care of themselves, the family, and sell for profit, and a mule to work the land. 40 acres and a mule. But the plan never passed. It was considered to be too radical. A lot of Congress didn't like the idea of seizing property and redistributing it. So the 40 acres and a mule plan was struck down. What was passed in 1865 was the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, this bureau was placed under the command of Army General Oliver O. Howard, provided elite aid to loyal refugees and freedmen. That is, it provided support for whites, but only if they were on the Union side. For the freedmen, but basically in terms of medical care, at hospitals, doctors, at food, for refugees. Remember, there are swarms of refugees going back and forth here trying to... their homes have been destroyed, the farms wrecked, they're on the road. It's complete chaos in the war. On top of that, you have a lot of bandits, some former Confederates basically turned to theft. Those that were in the war basically taking advantage of the chaos and the stream of refugees. But the Freedmen's Bureau is designed to take care of the refugees, loyal refugees, and freedmen. But also provided schools and legal aid. Basically helped the freedmen with labor contracts, helping them negotiate what they would be working for in a particular season with landowners. Or if they were to be sharecroppers, what the share of the crop would be. But with the Freedmen's Bureau, though, some of the schools that were built, this proved to be some of the first schools that these states, some southern states had. First statewide school system some of these southern states had. Arkansas, for example, did not have a statewide school system until after the Civil War. Same with Texas, same with Alabama, and several other states. Land was made available under a rental program. There was something called the Southern Homestead Act, which basically took federal lands and tried to give it away to settlers. It was more successful in some states than others. It was modestly successful in Arkansas, land given to both white settlers and freedmen. Worked out reasonably well in Arkansas, but only a couple hundred families were able to take advantage of it. But land basically abandoned was rented out through the Freedmen's Bureau. That land had been seized by Union officials from former Confederate officials. That was rented out. The problem was, though, as these Confederate officials regained their land, these slaves who were renting this land, they had the lands the lands they were renting taken out, stripped away from underneath their feet, and they were kicked off, basically made homeless very quickly because these Confederate officials had been pardoned. There was a lot of resentment from former Confederates about the Freedmen's Bureau because it was only helping the freedmen, the loyal refugees. What ended up happening was there were several riots against Freedmen's Bureau Bureau offices, and a couple of these Freedmen's Bureau schools were burned down. What else you have is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Radical Republicans are hoping this would be kind of a moderate measure that even Johnson would be willing to accept. What it does is it defines national citizenship for persons born or naturalized in the United States. Basically, anyone born in the United States, born American soil, regardless of the condition of their parents, was an American citizen. Clearing up that issue once and for all. Also specified that all citizens have the same rights to due process of law. that is basically defining that everyone born in the United States was a citizen. Whether they've been born slaves or born free, or else they were all citizens, naturalized citizens coming into the United States. They would be citizens, and they would all have the same rights under law. They would be equal under law. But Johnson vetoed this act. Johnson still committed to the idea of white supremacy. He wants the South reunified, but is not particularly concerned with the idea of black equality. In fact, it's actually very much against it. The Congress, however, overrode the veto. Both houses, with a 2/3 majority vote, voted to override the veto. This is the first successful override of a presidential veto in American history. But there are many other issues as well. All these newly reconstituted governments in the South, they're trying to reinstitute slavery in different ways. Basically trying to turn back the clock to 1860. Trying to mandate that freedmen have jobs, particularly working on plantations. To be arrested for vagrancy for not having a paid signed labor contract. Then basically forced on to work work on somebody's plantation. Violence against African Americans escalated dramatically. You have organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan organizing. Ku Klux doesn't actually mean anything. It's just something name they made up. The Ku Klux Klan, they assassinated Unionist officials, Unionist sympathizers, lynched African Americans, butchered, murdered them, burned homes. Very few of them were actually caught. In Arkansas, in 1866, you have what they called the Militia War. It's a series of running gunfights all over the state between the state militia forces and forces of the Ku Klux Klan until they're finally forced out of the state altogether. Some states instituted what they call black codes. Now these were a series of laws basically designed to enforce the system of white supremacy. Jim Crow is coming into focus. It's unveiled through these systems, the black codes, as they're called. Basically, it would define such things as it varied from city to city and state to state, but in some cases curfews, but for African Americans only. Some cases, such things as blacks couldn't walk on a sidewalk with whites at the same time. Mandating that blacks had to have labor contracts, otherwise be arrested for vagrancy. Or sharecroppers who had fallen very deeply in debt to landholders that they couldn't leave their lands until they paid back all their debts. Basically, any way they could think of to humiliate African Americans and force them back into positions of servants. Basically, try to bring back slavery, but in a different form. Keep the idea that whites would dominate the South, the blacks would be subservient. Because slavery is gone, racism and white supremacy were very much alive. What ends up happening in the 1866 midterm elections, because of the bitter division between Johnson and congressional Republicans on Reconstruction policy, Republicans win a 2/3 veto-proof majority in Congress, dominated by radical Republicans. And this would end the period of presidential Reconstruction, the period of radical Reconstruction. Because they had a veto-proof majority, they could override any of Johnson's vetoes at will. Congress now could dictate Reconstruction policy. Johnson now was simply hardly even an impediment anymore. It's a little more than a nuisance. So the Reconstruction policy would be the Military Reconstruction Acts of 1867. A series of 3 acts. They divide the southern states into 5 military districts. 2 for each district. Tennessee was exempted because they had already ratified what would become the 14th Amendment, which was passed in Congress in 1866. Of the 10 remaining states, would be broken up into these 5 military districts. Military government, basically martial law in these states. Freedmen be registered to vote by the military. That is to make sure state officials and civilians wouldn't lose the applications or would destroy them. The military be charged of voting records. Confederate officials were banned from voting. Qualified voters who never supported the Confederacy would draw a new state constitution that guaranteed African American suffrage and ratified the 14th Amendment. New governments that guaranteed racial equality and ratified the 14th Amendment. And then they'd be readmitted. So slowly these states did, a little at a time. Now, Johnson's National Union movement had collapsed. Johnson was unable to gather any kind of support. Found a few sympathetic Republicans and Democrats, but not enough. Now, one thing the radicals are trying to push through is the 14th Amendment. So this will be ratified in 1868. Essentially, through this amendment, they are trying to codify in the Constitution their Reconstruction plans. Basically make it free from legal interference of any future Congress, or particularly President Johnson. There are several different parts of it. You have a page in the back of the book here. Ratified on July 28, 1868. Basically, the first part is that persons born or naturalized in the United States to be subject to jurisdiction thereof. Is basically you're born in the United States, you're a citizen of the state of which you reside and the United States. Basically, you are a citizen. Now, Section 1 is the portion of this amendment that still applies mostly to the United States directly today. It's designed at Reconstruction efforts in 1868. Basically saying the freedmen, they will become citizens, regardless of whether they were born in slavery, they would become citizens. Born on American soil, you are a citizen, no matter what. You are an American. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person of this jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Section 2 is an interesting one. Basically said that if the rights of a group of people were denied in a state, then the number of representatives, number of congressmen in that state would be taken away in proportion to those citizens whose rights were being denied. So basically, here's the thing. Remember the 3/5 compromise. For apportionment, number of seats in Congress, one slave counts as 3/5 of a free man. Well, now now that slavery's gone, 3/5 compromise is invalid. All those freedmen now be counted as full citizens, as full people for citizens and for apportionment. So these southern states are getting more seats in Congress as a result. But because of the black codes and other pieces of legislation, blacks aren't able to vote. Basically, it's the same system as before, dominated by the old white planters, the old planter class. So here's what happened is these northern congressmen have to explain to their constituents that under the system they had before this, that yes, the South lost before, but now they're more powerful politically because of it. Southern planters still calling the shots, but now they have more seats in Congress to even out the numbers in the House of Representatives. Didn't make sense to northern politicians still grieving the losses of the men on their own side. So, if African Americans are not given the right to vote, then that many people not given the right to vote, votes taken away. That was the number of seats in Congress taken away. It was never really exercised, but it was a threat. Section 3 basically saying if you've been a Confederate official, you will not have any political rights unless Congress votes with a 2/3 majority vote to remove that man. It's done on an individualized basis. The fourth Confederate debt. This actually was an issue because the South ran up a lot of bills during the war. A lot of companies are trying to collect. It's basically for a lot of companies, foreign in the South and abroad, they were looking to make money off the Confederacy. The North says, no, this was an illegal activity. Secession was never legal. You aren't going to make a dime off of this. They said the South had to repudiate all debts. Nobody's getting any money off this. So that was the 14th Amendment. Basically codifying the radical plan for Congress, the radical plan for Reconstruction. Now, among the Reconstruction Acts, the military was authorized in July 1867 under the Third Reconstruction Act to remove officials resisting these efforts. Basically, they periodically removed Southern politicians they felt were not cooperating enough with Reconstruction, including governors. So you have entire slates of local and even statewide officials being removed from office that thought they're impeding Reconstruction. This is three different acts here. This is basically the first one, break up into the military districts, registration through the Second Military Act. But with the Third Reconstruction Act, they had to go for what they called the Ironclad Oath. That potential voters had to say not only repudiate the Confederacy and repudiate secession, but they also have to swear that they never took up arms against the North. I think basically most of the adult male white population in the South meant Unionists and freedmen were dominating these governments. Well, the Third Reconstruction Act had to, registrars would not give the right to vote to anyone unless they could prove that they had not taken up arms against the Union. Well, what's happening here is the major political parties are basically, in some ways, kind of the reverse of what they are now. The Democrats have been resistant to ending slavery and resistant to civil rights activities. African Americans voting overwhelmingly for Republicans at this point because they are seen as the party of Abraham Lincoln and emancipation. The Republicans fighting most for civil rights for African Americans. And this is the way it's going to be mostly until about the 1920s and 1930s. At this point, Republicans nationally start dropping their support for civil rights efforts in order to try to gain support of Southern white conservatives. And basically by taking those moves and even actively removing African Americans from control of state Republican Party organizations in the South, they effectively alienate African American voters. So by the 1930s, Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt and the National Democratic Party are more receptive to civil rights. They're including African Americans in the New Deal programs to try to help the country recover from the devastation of the Great Depression. And because of this, African Americans start switching their allegiance overwhelmingly from Republican to Democratic because of civil rights. Now, there are a fair number of Republicans, more liberal Republicans, that supported civil rights, but there's a growing conservative wing of the Republican Party that is opposed to civil rights legislation. And basically, by the 1960s, it took Southern Democrats to push through major civil rights legislation and finally ended Jim Crow. Harry Truman in the 1940s, Democrat, desegregated the military. So increasingly, on a national scale, the Democrats were increasingly friendly to civil rights, while Republicans were increasingly against it. Give an example. In 1964, Texas Republican Senator John Town, Republican, voted against the Civil Rights Act, while Democratic Senator Ralph Yarborough voted for it, signed by Democratic President Lyndon Johnson of Texas. As late as 1960, African Americans still tend to vote for the party of Lincoln, but after major civil rights legislation, political roles essentially switched. Republicans began taking control of the South, while more African Americans started voting Democratic. We have almost 95% of African Americans voting Republican during Reconstruction under the turn of the century. Last half of the 20th century to the beginning of the 21st century, it's the reverse. African Americans voting 95% Democratic, and over the issue of civil rights. Now, initially, the Republican Party of the South largely consisted of Union Democrats. For example, Texas Governor Andrew J. Hamilton was a Union Democrat, became a Republican, provisional governor of the state in 1865-66. And not only was it Union Democrats, but freedmen, Union soldiers who were living in the South, either still in the service or just retired, decided to settle down in the South, and a handful of immigrants from the North who coming to the South who were also voting Republican. That's the Republican Party in the South in the 1860s and 1870s. Then we've got this interesting little thing here, carpetbaggers and scalawags. Now, carpetbaggers, these are basically Northerners who moved south for various business opportunities after the war. Called that because of this image of cheap con men and these cheap suitcases made out of carpet. But you have different people, different means and so forth coming to the South. Except carpetbaggers really dominate only in areas like Virginia and Louisiana. You have a few here and there across the rest of the South, including Arkansas, Texas, Mississippi, and so forth. But basically, most of the Republicans in these Reconstruction governments after the Civil War are from other areas in the South. There aren't carpetbaggers from the North coming to the South, dominating the South. They're from other areas of the South, except only in maybe a couple of areas. Scalawag, that was a term for Southerners who supported these Reconstruction governments, okay, the white Southerners, basically sympathizers with these carpetbaggers and Union soldiers and so forth. They're scalawags. Basically, those were meant to be great insults at that time period. Well, Freedmen's Bureau continued until it was disbanded in 1869. Congress was furious at the abuses of African American civil rights in the South. Lynchings and blacks and Republican officials erupted throughout the South. In Arkansas, you had a former Confederate General Thomas Hyman, a former congressman from before the war. He said after the war in Arkansas that the people must come together, must accept the end of slavery, must accept that a new South is coming. And for that, he was assassinated. A sitting congressman in Arkansas was assassinated not long afterward. Congress began demanding the protection of basic civil liberties and freedom. This is what the Civil Rights Bill comes from. But that is vetoed. The Congress overrides it, and this bill is passed over the veto, and the 14th Amendment is ratified. Because the Northern Congress, what they're trying to do is, well, the best way to protect the civil liberties of African Americans and prevent a recurrence of the Civil War is basically to break down the South, basically start over fresh, and rebuild the South in the Northern Republican image. Basically, the African Americans make up the bulk, the numbers of the Republican Party. They would be voting to enforce their own civil liberty, to protect their civil liberties, civil rights, voting, jury duty, service in the state militias. Some states that ban the African Americans from serving on juries or on the state militias. And essentially, they would keep the planter class from coming back into play. So remember, in some states, African Americans were the majority, but the planters have suppressed them for generations. Carpetbaggers become target of violence. But a lot of this has been coming to the South. They're trying to get railroads started in the South. What ends up happening is the South tries to modernize and tries to build railroads and rebuild its old railroad system. And so the states issue extraordinarily high taxes on the population. Basically, the population is still bankrupt and broken. Counties are forcing counties to raise taxes very high in order to finance these railroads. Some of these counties never have. So on top of a broken and bitter population having to face a defeat, they're also having to face all these taxes for all these railroads, which they may not even have any kind of benefit. Violence everywhere. But interestingly enough, talking about the violence in the South, Southern resistance to Reconstruction is so great in some areas, particularly East Texas, it was suggested that another Sherman's March was needed through this area to subjugate them. What I meant by that was, in those counties that Sherman had marched through in Georgia and South Carolina, the devastation was so great that there was practically no resistance at all to Reconstruction during this time period. Broke their will to fight. Well, Johnson tried to impede radical Reconstruction by countermanding orders of military officials and trying to fire radical Republicans into his administration. Now, Congress had passed something called the Tenure of Office Act to prevent these firings. Basically, said that any official in the president's cabinet or the president's administration could not be fired without congressional approval. Rehiring cannot be done without congressional approval. Now, some considered impeaching Johnson for firing some of these officials, and some tried to limit his authority to give orders to the military. For example, eventually got to the point where Johnson cannot give orders to the military unless they went through General Grant first. So in 1867, Johnson fired his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Stanton had been a Lincoln appointee. Well, the Senate refused to approve it. In January 1868, Johnson ordered General Grant to become War Secretary, but Grant refused. And then he appoints General Lorenzo Thomas, who agrees to become War Secretary. Stanton had barricaded himself in his office to try to prevent from being removed from the office. Well, House Representatives found that Johnson had violated the Tenure of Office Act. Basically, he had fired someone without congressional permission, appointed someone else without congressional permission, and on February 24th, 1868, impeached Johnson. Remember the impeachment process. The House votes on impeachment. Basically, it's a simple majority vote to impeach. Congress has, the House of Representatives basically is indicting. Basically, they're drawing up the charges against the president, or it could be a sitting judge or someone else, ambassador or something like that. Members of Congress simply, their own individual House votes whether or not to keep them in office or expel them. But for executive officials, like the president, like the vice president, ambassadors, federal judges, and so forth, the House of Representatives goes through the impeachment process. Now, the direct charges against Johnson, saying basically he violated this act, the 10-year of office act. And that's their indictment, the impeachment charge that the House managers are going to carry into the Senate. The Senate would then try the president. And the Senate takes a 2/3 majority vote to convict and remove from office. So Johnson has been impeached, the first president in history to be impeached. Now, as for Stanton, he eventually accepted his firing, and John M. Schofield becomes War Secretary. Trials in the Senate becomes a spectacle. Tickets are sold for people to witness the proceedings. Now, if Johnson was impeached, it meant House Speaker Thaddeus Stevens would become president. One of the House managers actually prosecuting the case. Well, Johnson never speaks in his defense in the Senate, but he barely attacks his impeachment in public. His attorneys argue that his impeachment failed to meet the requirement of high crimes and misdemeanors as required in the Constitution for removal from office. The 10-year of office act, they argued, was a political crime, not an indictable crime. They further argued that the 10-year office act did not apply to Stanton because Stanton was a Lincoln appointee. Basically, this is an after-the-fact law. Stanton was not covered by that law. That's what Johnson's lawyers are arguing. But the radical Republicans want Johnson out of the way. Once and for all, get rid of him. Teachers argued that the violation of the act was sufficient, but his real crime is resistance to Reconstruction, resistance to the will of the legislative branch. Congress still considered the dominant branch at this point. But you have a number of Republicans on the fence. They're offered bribes from pro- and anti-impeachment forces and threatened the end of their careers if they vote one way for another. So 7 Republican senators break and vote to acquit Johnson, avoiding removal from office by one vote. One vote saves Johnson being removed from office. The acquittal actually preserves the independence of the presidency and prevents the takeover of the presidency by the legislative branch. But despite their embarrassment of failing to remove Johnson, they effectively neutralized his opposition to their plans in his remaining months in office. Which gets us to the election of 1868. Now, the 1868 election, the Democrats tried to stick to economic issues, mainly with the New York Governor Horatio Seymour. But the Republican Party based its campaign on defensive Reconstruction policies and celebrating the war hero nominee Ulysses S. Grant. The Republican Party has cynically told voters, vote the way you shot, implying that Democrats were the party's secession. Now, by waving the bloody shirt, as it was called, the Republican Party was able to dominate post-war politics in the North and won an easy victory in 1868. Now, ironically, as Democrats regained control in the South, former Confederate officials, they did the same thing, telling them to vote the way they voted, telling Confederate veterans to vote the way they shot, as against Northern Republicans. Well, Grant wins an easy victory, defeating Seymour by a vote of 53% to 47%. Most of the southern states not participating because of the Military Reconstruction Acts. Grant gets 214 electoral votes to Seymour's 8. Now, as we get into the 1870s, Reconstruction is still a dominant issue. The military is trying to pacify the South, trying to end the waves of violence and the riots. But another issue, though, was increasing corruption. The post-Civil War era post-Reconstruction era especially, it's going to be the most corrupt period in American history. Most of it was centering around railroads. Railroad construction surged. The Transcontinental Railroad completed in 1867 at Promontory Point in Utah. So you could travel coast to coast by a train by this point. Other transcontinental railroads other routes be completed in the coming years. This basically is the route going from Chicago to San Francisco. Again, through the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, because the South wasn't there to object, the North gives the hub of the Transcontinental Railroad to, they say, Union City, Chicago, Illinois. And Chicago goes from a city of just over 100,000 to a city of nearly 2 million by the end of the century. A city of over 1 million by the end of the century, excuse me. Today, Chicago is a city of 3 million. Well, pig iron production for use of manufacture of steel rails and also for trains that more than doubled. Sugar and cotton production recovered by the late 1860s. So the South actually has products to ship back and forth, and train is the most logical way to do that. Those disputes of how are you going to pay for this? Well, Congress is getting out a lot of land to these railroads, tons of land, more land they really needed, and Congress is giving out more and more and more land. In the meantime, though, you had the issue of the war debt. Secretary of the Treasury, Hugh McCulloch, started taking paper money out of circulation of the war end and trying to return to a sound money system that is a strict gold standard. That is, the value of the dollar would be tied exactly to the amount of gold held in reserves. The guy right hand by local banks. What they're doing is all the money is printed off this gold. What you have is this gold here, and $1 is printed off to represent 1 ounce of this gold. But they end up printing up more money to try to deal with their debts and cash shortages, which meant that the value of this dollar dropped because it's being based on the same amount of gold. It's called inflation. But to resort back to a sound money, the gold standard system, they're going to deflation. That is, removing this dollar and just simply going to less paper money representing the same amount of gold, therefore increasing the value of money. The value of money increases, where inflation, value of money decreases. So why is McCulloch doing this to pay off these debts? Well, who are they paying? Who's the union paying back these debts to? Northern bankers. And they want to be paid back in money that is valued as possible, money that is valued a lot more than this. So our decision of deflation, value of money is going up, prices are going down. Good for consumers, but bad for farmers because prices of commodities going down. Prices are going up under inflation. So let's suppose, for example, I borrowed $50 from you in a period of massive deflation, basically doubling the value of money. 6 months when I pay back that $50, that same $50 will be paying you back $100. In fact, the value of buying power are the same. Let's suppose I borrow that $50 from you, and a system of massive inflation sets in, cutting the value of money in half. That's 6 months. That's basically at $50. I'd be like paying you back like $25. So if you owe money, inflation works for you better. But deflation, it works if somebody owes you money because the value of what they're paying you back is worth more and more and more. And these northern bankers want deflation. So as a result, more deflation, value of money going up, prices going down, this is hitting farmers across the Midwest, causing their commodity prices to drop. Like no matter how much they produce, prices are falling because of monetary deflation, because of the gold standard. Well, farmers got less money for their crops, less money than they were expecting to pay off their debts, hurting northern and southern farmers. In 1868, many began demanding return of paper money, the greenback dollar bills. Now, Democrats had advocated the greenback policy in 1868 under pressure from Midwestern. Seymour from New York, where all the banks were in the Northeast, backs the gold standard idea, which cost them a lot of support. Now, by the early 1870s, the Republicans were wanting to retire the remaining $356 million in greenbacks still in circulation. But a business pact in 1873 led to clamor to issue more paper money to stimulate the economy. In 1873, the government, as a result, demonetized silver. That is basically took silver out of the equation, where they're valuing money on both using value of silver also to value money. They're taking silver out of the equation, leading to even more deflation. In 1875, Grant is fully backing a call for resumption of a strict gold standard, which caused further deflation and enraged farmers. A lot of Democrats, though, are still backing this, still fearful of what counterfeiting could do to the economy. So a third party formed at this point, the National Greenback Party. So their goal is print greenback dollars. That is, they want inflation. Designed for the farmers. Print more money, print more paper money, which causes inflation, causes the value of money to drop, but prices increase, particularly prices for farmers selling their crops. They make more money and are able to get back their debt through monetary inflation. Well, they ended up poorly in the 1876 election. They elected 14 congressmen in 1878 to led the farm reform movements in the 1880s and 1890s. Populist, the wave of economic reforms they pushed. This is the beginning of a major wave of reform starting from the economic problems of farmers in the 1870s. But Grant's administration, for all the skill and cunning he had shown on the battlefield, he was a disaster as president because of the credit mobilier scandal. Politicians being bribed left and right to give more money, loans, and grants and land for railroads. Several congressmen and legislators ended up going to jail over it, but probably most notorious is the credit mobilier scandal. This is a fictitious shipping company, Credit Mobilier, that served as a front for siphoning off profits meant to go to shareholders of the Union Pacific Railroad. Basically, Union Pacific is taking money from their profits, creating this little company, and issuing fake stock certificates to members of Congress and even presidential cabinet members and state legislators. Basically, these fake stock certificates basically just giving them money, so in turn they will, these politicians will give the railroads more money and more land to build more railroads and make more money. So Credit Mobilier stock is given to many prominent officials in the Grant administration, including the Vice President at the time, Schuyler Colfax. Instead of epitomizing the corruption of the Grant administration, slowly destroyed public confidence in Grant and led to calls for civil service reform. It's so bad the Republican Party splits in 1872 over the issue of corruption in government, essentially over the Credit Mobilier scandal. Now, Grant could have let some of these office holders go, could have fired them, but he's so loyal to them that he ended up destroying his own reputation trying to protect them. So what ends up happening is the Democrats in 1872 will go with a fusion ticket with the liberal Republicans, that branch of Republicans favoring reform. Call it fusion. So we've got Democrats, liberal Republicans nominating New York newspaper editor Horace Greeley. What it said so many years ago, go west, young man. Such a proponent of a manifest destiny. And the Republicans are going with U.S. Grant again. Greeley hated Republicans for years and openly expressed his hatred of them for a long time, so it's alienating a lot of liberal Republicans. And his editorial stands from his newspaper editorials over the years alienated even more people. Basically, the New York Herald Tribune she had run had been basically issuing his opinion on everything, which came back to haunt him years later. Well, fusing moderate Republicans and Democrats failed throughout the country, especially in the South, where Democrats had use fusion to dislodge a radical Republican governments. Grant ends up being reelected by an even wider margin, in spite of the scandals like Credit Mobilier, 56% to 44%. Largely because of fears of conservatives regaining control of governments in the South. Basically, fears of the planters regaining control in the South. Waving the bloody shirt once again, they're able to win. Well, Grant gets 286 electoral votes, but Greeley gets 66 electoral votes. But here's the problem. Greeley dies before the electoral votes are counted. It's not much of a point, though, because Grant ends up winning anyway. Well, chaos, violence, and instability ruled many parts of the South through Reconstruction. Corruption, crime, and apparent in government throughout the region. Freedmen began their life as independent farmers. By June 1865, 40,000 black farmers worked on 300,000 acres of what they believed was their own land, but in many cases it's changed. Other farmers, black and white, reclaimed the ruined fields and became very productive tillers of the soil. But many freedmen, however, failed to acquire the legal title of the farms or did not have the means to own their own lands. Others had their lands outright stolen from them. Sharecropping was initially seen by many African Americans, many whites, as the means of acquiring their own land, but sharecroppers had to live on credit until their crops were sold. That is, the only time farmers had money is when they sell their crops, but they have to live and eat in the meantime. And who's going to give them that credit to live and work at the local store or whatever? The landowners. Now, as a sharecropper, basically, you're giving up a share of your crop to crop you produce on that land you're renting as the cost of your rent. But the cost of debts were added on top of that at very high interest rates. So eventually, it gets to the point where the sharecroppers are so deep in debt that they can never get off the lands. They're stuck there trying to work to pay off their debts, but they can never produce enough to pay it off. Seeds of segregation were set by the Black Codes of 1865, and attempts to integrate public schools were attempted in New Orleans at the University of South Carolina. Schools that were established in other parts of the South were segregated, but New Orleans and USC, they attempted integration, at least initially. Now, these radical governments in power stayed in power from about 1 to 9 years across the South, depending on the state. Freedmen constituted the bulk of the Southern Republican Party. The Republicans helped establish permanent education systems across the region, appropriated funds for expansion of public facilities and social programs, and also heavily subsidized the railroads. But the cost of all these new programs on an impoverished, beaten population were too much for them to bear. So the Southern population starts to hate the Republicans for these high taxes, for the increasing problems of corruption. More and more officials being bribed left and right, stealing from the government. What ends up happening is, for the first time, Republicans have never been on the ballot in parts of the South. These officials are elected or appointed. They're imposing these crushing taxes and providing over corrupt administrations. This is the first time Republicans are on the ballot, showing what they're capable of, basically showing they can't govern. And they can point to all the problems they were facing, like there being all the pressures they're facing from former Confederates basically trying to starve them out by not doing business with them, or the violence in the South causing officials to react strongly to preserve order. But the fact is, taxes were high, corruption was high, Republicans were in power. Waste and graft sent state debt soaring. With public money flowing for new programs, many unscrupulous politicians took advantage of the people and stole from the government, or bribed by special interests to throw public funds their way. Now, the same thing's happening with this in the North. You have the same corruption in the South that's happening in the North, but you don't have the additional burden of being defeated, living in basically what is now post-war wasteland. Even though it's recovering, they're trying to rebuild, but they see some people taking all their tax dollars, living lavishly while they are struggling even to survive. This is why it ends up happening when these Republican governments are defeated. Republicans don't come back into power in most of these states for another century. Now, African Americans were elected to Congress across the South for the first time during Reconstruction. Between 1869 and 1880, 16 African Americans served in Congress, and 2, including Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, served as U.S. Senators. No African Americans were ever elected governor. However, in Louisiana, P.B.S. Pinchback briefly served as acting governor when the existing governor stepped down and resigned from office. Basically, he was lieutenant governor and becomes acting governor in Louisiana. It wasn't until 1991 when an African American was elected governor of any state. In this case, Douglas Wilder of Virginia. In South Carolina, African Americans briefly comprised a majority of the South Carolina House of Representatives. But as Democrats returned to power, many were thrown out of office in ensuing elections. But some African Americans continued to hold office at local levels in many areas of the South until the turn of the century. The economy slowly rebuilding in the South and booming in the North. Southern agricultural output had dropped after the war briefly, but recovering slowly. But by the end of Reconstruction in 1876, the Southern economy still not reached its 1860 levels in terms of acreage, use, or output. But what ends up happening as the 1870s roll on, the second half of Grant's presidency, the Republican Party is slowly backing away from Reconstruction. They're just tired of the fights, tired of having to defend all these policies, tired of having to shore up these and defend these administrations. 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified. An amendment guaranteeing that African American men would have the right to vote. They could not. That states could not discriminate in voter participation based on race. However, it was worded in a way that, because of the growing women's suffrage movement, that states could allow African American men to vote, but could still keep women from voting. By 1870, though, the right of African American men to vote was guaranteed under the Constitution. But future governments, southern governments, will try to find a way to work around this. Northern commitment to black civil rights in the South waned. Ku Klux Klan violence continued across the South. The Klan intimidation of black voters in Georgia and Louisiana in 1868, playing for Grant's loss in those states. But you have some factionalism so great that voter fraud is common. So much to the point that democracy almost becomes a joke in some of these areas. The 1872 Arkansas governor's race. There's so many ballots stuffed one way and another towards different candidates that they're still not sure who won. The Klan inspired insurrections against Republican governments in the South helped conservatives return to power, because the old conservative planter class come back to power. And as they came back to power, a series of laws were passed to try to thwart the Klan, such as police acts, bans on masks in public, and so forth, but largely failed. After Reconstruction, the Klan will largely disappear, but it'll see a massive resurgence in the 1920s. But the 1920s won't just be in the South, it'll be nationwide. In 1875, race riots broke out in Mississippi, but African American voters were intimidated from voting, but Grant refused to call out troops. As a result, Mississippi returned its conservatives to office. We have one last effort to try to defend civil rights by Congress. That is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Under this legislation, this prohibited racial discrimination in jury selection, public jury selection, public transportation, and public accommodations. Basically, it's trying to stop the black codes on the federal level. It's an attempt to try to maintain the civil rights of African Americans, trying to stop Jim Crow in its tracks. Jury selection was the most important part of this, to make sure that African Americans could sit on juries, and any African Americans accused of crimes would have a jury of their peers to plead their case. But also, African American victims of crime, particularly those victimized by whites in the Ku Klux Klan and so forth, they would also have sympathetic figures on those juries of their peers, so they could plead their case as well. But what happened is in the South, very rarely would white juries convict white men for crimes against African Americans. Almost never are they convicted of murders against African Americans, or rape, theft, or assault, or anything like that. It ended up being the other way around. It would be called self-defense. African Americans would be beaten and then sent to jail because they're accused of assault. In fact, it was not until the 1990s that a white who murdered a black man was found guilty and given the death penalty for it. In 1998, when two white men in East Texas lynched a man named James Byrd, basically dragged him behind their truck for a couple of miles until he died. They were given the death penalty. That was the first time that had ever happened in the South, that has been given a death penalty for an act like that. In many cases, murders against African Americans, those accused were never indicted, never went to jail. Well, now you get to the election of 1876. The Democrats are hoping to come back into power. They had regained power in 1874. Largely on the issue of corruption in office, largely against Grant and his corruption, Republican presidential corruption. What ended up happening was what they called the salary grab of 1874. Republicans in Congress voted for a massive pay raise, retroactive to 1866. Basically, a huge amount of money to be giving themselves, and people decided that enough was enough. Democrats were given a majority in the House of Representatives and the Senate. So it's 1876. Democrats hoping to take back the White House. And it comes down between the nominees are Samuel Tilden, he's the governor of New York. New York had long been a stronghold for Democrats. And Governor Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. Hayes had been a Civil War general as well. Simply trying to wave a bloody shirt again. Well, as governor of Ohio, Hayes had been largely untouched by scandals in the Grant's administration. Had run a relatively clean administration. Tilden is running on a theme of honesty in government. A very close election, very tightly contested election. What ends up happening is Tilden ends up winning the popular vote by a vote of 51%, 68%. Third party greenbacker running, but it's not really an issue. So basically, Tilden has won the popular vote by 250,000 votes. But remember, the Constitution says it's the Electoral College where it counts. So 3 states were in dispute. Oregon, Louisiana, and of course, Florida. Now, they never could count. There's a lot of accusations of ballot boxes being stuffed left and right. Now, Tilden is holding with 184 electoral votes. He needs one more vote to push him over the top. South is voting again. They're readmit, all other states readmitted. But Hayes needs all these electoral votes to win the presidency. And there are people going out trying to find ballots, trying to ballot boxes being stuffed one way and another, electors being offered bribes to vote one way or another. But these 3 states are in dispute. So it's going on for weeks, months even. So the outcome of the election, the undecided, Congress appointed a special electoral commission, which came to be dominated by Republicans. It was going to be equal Democrats, equal Republicans, and 1 independent. But that independent was offered a federal judgeship. He resigns, and he's replaced by a Republican. Now, the commission, voting on strictly party line votes, gave all disputed votes to Hayes, and the Republican Senate approved it. But the Democrats in the House were ready to filibuster. It's got a split House. Democrats in the House, Republicans in the Senate. But Senate is saying that Hayes won. The Democrats in the House are saying no. And if the filibuster succeeded, neither candidate would have a majority of electoral votes on inauguration day in the House. Largely Democratic would decide it. Well, Tilden opposed federal subsidies for railroad construction because of all the corruption surrounded by it. Now, Tilden is calling for the end of Reconstruction, pull the troops out of the South, but also saying end federal subsidies for railroads. But you have a large number of Southerners who are saying, we want some of those railroad subsidies so we can rebuild the South. They believe that Hayes supported these. So the Republicans cut a deal with the Democrats, saying if they gave their votes to Hayes, that Reconstruction would end, and railroad money would be going to the South. So Hayes had already decided to abandon federal support for radical regimes in the South, and Democrats have been planning to march on Washington to present a Hayes presidency, but these plans fizzled as the Republican negotiations with the Southern Democrats ensured the election to Hayes. Hayes wins the vote by 1 electoral vote. 185 and 184. And though Tilden had won in the popular column. So 4 times in American history, the winner of the popular vote loses the presidential election because he lost the electoral college. Remember Andrew Jackson in 1824? He didn't get a majority of the electoral votes, but he won the election, won the most votes, lost in the House of Representatives. This is the second time. 1876, Tilden loses to Hayes. Third time, 1888. President Grover Cleveland wins most of the popular votes, but loses the Electoral College to Benjamin Harrison. Fourth time, 2000, Al Gore won popular vote by 500,000 votes, but lost in the Electoral College because all the Florida electoral votes were given to George W. Bush. Actually, 4 times it happens. All 4 times, winning popular vote was a Democrat. So ends up happening as Hayes becomes the 19th president. Reconstruction ends in the South, and Tilden returns to quiet obscurity, declining to run again in 1880 because of health concerns. We also have an interesting group here at the end, starting to come back in the South, called the Redeemers. It's called the Bourbons. The old French ruling family who was overthrown during the French Revolution comes back to power after the Revolution. It's a group of Southern conservatives after the war bent on rebuilding the South industrially and ending radical Republican control. They're calling for investing in railroads, factories, road, and industry, trying to build a new South, one built on industry and free labor, not on slavery. It'll still be one logically based on white supremacy. Basically, trying to build a new, technologically based, modern South. This old ruling party called themselves the Conservative Party of Virginia and the Conservative Democrats in other states, but it's largely a combination of old Whigs and Democrats uniting to rid the South of Republicans. In many cases, some of these Democratic candidates, these offices and these across the South were old Whigs. It was more of a matter of convenience in the early 1870s led to a resurgence of the Democratic Party in the South. By 1877, the last vestiges of radical control was gone in the South. All the states were back under control of the old planter class. They were dominating these state governments once again. They start seeing industrialization of the South, but it's lagging behind the North for decades. Still, many areas of the South, especially the rural South, they're not seeing any kind of industrialization. Any kind of factories come to be some of the larger cities, like the state capitals or port cities, if that. But new issues would await the nation in the following decades. The wounds of the Civil War slowly healed, but problems of farmers, industrial workers, and race relations caused new controversy the decade that followed. America is dawning into its second century, a decade where it come to be a world power, facing new problems and new issues, but always facing the future with that same sense of determination